Welcome everyone. My name is Susan Derber, and before we start this webinar, please allow me to share some brief technical things. First of all, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available soon on the World Council of Churches YouTube channel. And during this session, we are very happy to gather your questions for questions and answer. And please use the Q&A function to ask your questions to the speakers. And in case you need any technical support during the webinar, please reach out in writing to the WCC technical support team via the Zoom chat box. So, I am Susan Derber, I'm the moderator of the Faith and Order Commission, and I give you a very warm welcome to this webinar. The purpose of the Faith and Order Commission is to serve the churches as they call one another to visible unity in one faith and in one Eucharistic fellowship, in worship, in common life, in witness and service to the world. This is our long and patient and privileged task, and today's webinar is one part of a long story. Since there ever was a church or churches, Christians have talked about what it means to be the church. And this conversation has been marked by disagreement, but also by convergence and agreement. In 2013, after years of work and consultation, Faith and Order published a text called The Church Towards a Common Vision. And we invited many of you, churches, other bodies, individuals, to respond to it. And since then, a group of commissioners have been receiving your responses and analysing them, reflecting on them and seeking wisdom to discern the next steps for this long journey. We've now published the responses we've received, almost 80 of them, and today we publish and launch a short report about our findings from those responses, and you can see the link to that in the chat. In time, there will be another publication of longer papers reflecting on some key themes that emerged from your responses. In this series of webinars, we're going to present to you some things that we think we have heard from your responses to our text. This first one has mission as its focus. You will hear two presenters from the group who've been working on the responses, who will tell you not what they think, but what they heard the responses say about mission. And then we will hear a response to them as the conversation continues from His Eminence Metropolitan Gevorgese Kyrillos, the moderator of the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism, who has long been a very helpful and critical friend to Faith and Order. We are so grateful to you, Your Eminence, for being part of this. There will also be a time for questions, and so that we can present those to the panel and take them up afterwards too. Before we hear from our main presenters though, I just want to explain very briefly why mission has proved such an important part of this long discussion. And I can tell you the story very quickly by showing how our text developed. So the story has a beginning in a way with Baptism, Eucharist and Ministry, published in 1982, the first convergence text of Faith and Order. And as the churches reflected on that text, it became clear that we needed most to do some work on what it means to be the church. So after many years, we produced The Nature and Purpose of the Church, 1998. And that document was sent to the churches, but in reflecting on that, people realized that there was no mention of mission in the title. A church does not just have a purpose, it has a mission. So the title was changed in the next slide, The Nature and Mission of the Church. And that was published in 2005 with many more revisions. And then we had a big meeting in Crete in 2009. You can see a picture of this in the next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? There we are. a wonderful meeting in Crete in 2009, at which Metropolitan Georgesi Kyrillos made a wonderful speech, a profound intervention. He said the text seemed to him to be an ecclesiology from above, and he appealed for an ecclesiology from below that would treat the poor and the oppressed as real parts of the church. And he says that the text had an artificial dichotomy between the being of the church and the praxis of the church. We heard that message. So no more did we want the document to imply that the church has a nature first and then a mission, a being and then a purpose. So we realize that the church is mission and the mission belongs to God. So the content of the document was radically revised and the title was changed. Next slide, please. Here's the group that finalized the document, and here's the cover of the document with its new title. In the next slide, The Church Towards a Common Vision. So mission and the church in the world were much more a part of this text. So now we can stop sharing. Oh, here we are. Here's Odair, our director, receiving some of the responses. This was the Roman Catholic response when it came in. Thank you. So now we're going to turn to our first presenter, the Reverend Dr. Glenroy Lerlaw, who is a Baptist from Jamaica and a member of the Commission. And he is going to tell us what the responses said about mission. Glenroy.
Thank you, Suzanne. And good morning from Jamaica. I know it's good evening and good afternoon wherever you are in the world. In reviewing the document, going through the responses, there were some areas, some themes concerning mission that we could discern. And I'd like to indicate that, first of all, it would seem to me, and it seemed to us, that many of the churches in their response expressed appreciation that TCV sought to build on the insights developed over the years. Some of these understandings were expressed in earlier faith and order works and earlier faith and order documents, such as the nature and mission of the church. So you'll see in the first slide that we saw the responses as indicating a celebration of continuity between the nature and mission of the church and the documents prior, and the church towards a common vision. The fact that these insights were affirmed in TCV, and in some cases, churches express appreciation that TCV not only celebrated continuity, but moved beyond, expanded on some of these themes and some of these ideas. One such insight is the understanding that mission is the initiative of the sending God. The concept of the Missio Dei that first entered the conversation in 1952, continued through nature and mission, and it continues in and through the church towards a common vision. There was a celebration of that. And related to the celebration of the Missio Dei, coming from the church's response, was their understanding, the church's understanding that it is a sign and servant of God's plan for all creation. So one important observation that we made from the documents was that it was a celebration of continuity, but it also was an acknowledgement of expansion, that the TCV was going beyond that which was indicated in earlier documents. So the mission of the church in God's design was seen as not simply continuity, but also an expansion of earlier insights on mission. And that expansion was noted and celebrated, for example, and the quotation you're looking at on your screen is one offered by the Doctrine Commission of the Anglican Church of Australia. And they were celebrating the fact that mission was not merely an activity of the church, but an attribute of God. In their words, the document was moving towards a missional ecclesiology. Another point of celebration that we discerned from the document was that some churches in their responses rejoiced in the fact that the text explicitly related God's gift of communion, koinonia, to the missionary calling of the church. That received wide acclaim and was widely celebrated. And this viewpoint, as I said, was broadly celebrated, that mission and unity are both at the heart of how we see the calling of God's people. And there's a quotation I share with you from the Methodist Church of Ireland, which I think captures this very well. So we rejoice that the World Council of Churches has, through its Faith and Order Commission, produced a statement that brings these two themes together and invites Christians everywhere to rediscover their vision of what it is to be the church. The Baptist World Alliance responded to this and called this a notable addition or a notable advance beyond BEM. That's how they describe this idea of bringing mission and unity together. The Roman Catholic and the Salvation Army suggest that there's an important implication that issues to the churches from this bringing of mission and unity together. And it is that it impels Christians to be a sign of such koinonia for the world. It impels Christians to be a sign of such koinonia for the world. So there was broad celebration of a number of themes that represented continuity, and there was also rejoicing at the fact that there were some areas that represented an advance on our thinking, our conversation, beginning with BEM and coming through some of the earlier documents. But Suzanne, some of the responses also expressed some concerns, which we received as an indication that some questions still remain and that some matters require further exploration. And I'm sharing 4 of these concerns raised. One is a call for a broader understanding of mission, a call for a broader understanding of mission to enable the engagement of the church in this, what was described as this complex world. The Canadian Council of Churches, in their response, puts it this way: a broader sense and understanding of mission that is proclaiming the gospel in a multicultural and multi-religious society, and the church as a moral, ethical communion. So there was this appeal that the document still is calling the church to engage in a broader understanding of mission. There was another observation that indicates the need for further work is that for some of our respondents, TCTCV presented the nature and mission of the church as still too distinct, as if they were separate and not fully interrelated, not completely integrated. So there was that concern coming from some of the churches responding to the document. A third area was that the nature and content of evangelism And the concept of evangelization is still impatient of further work and further debate. One response says it like this: to evangelize, and this response is from the Roman Catholic Church, but it also received support from the response we saw from the inter-Orthodox consultation. To evangelize is to shape a personal, intimate discipleship with the Lord, encountering Christ and being transformed by his love. This will enable his disciples to authentically encounter their neighbors in their hope and needs, and to offer credible witness to the world in justice, solidarity, and charity. So that's another area, and this was a concern raised in particular from the community of Protestant churches in Europe, a kind of a warning that we are still conflating the kingdom of God and the church. And the warning was against conflating the kingdom of God and the church, and to say that the church is not the kingdom, but is itself a venue for God's mission, and will also be subject to God's judgment. So I'll conclude with this comment that what is emerging is, as a clear consensus, is that because mission has become a very clear priority in the life of many of our churches, a stronger focus on mission is being called. And I think the last slide sums up what I think we are hearing. The last slide will come up now, sums up what I think we are hearing. That the people are saying, we want more. And the universal request for the expansion of chapter 4 is an indication to us of the strength of this call. I would say the near universal request for that. So the focus of mission relates to the church as sign and servant, and the church is called to serve the world. That's a kind of a summary, Suzanne, of some of the findings that we gleaned from the document.
Thank you, Glenroy, very much indeed. So clearly we can see that what Faith and Order has achieved through this text and all the conversations leading to it is an expansion of a missional ecclesiology, but the people are still saying, we want more. That's what we've heard from the churches. Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Reverend Dr. Stephanie Dietrich to present to us something about what the church's responses said about the text and the church in and for the world, about the chapter 4 part of our document. And this will have some profound connections with what Glenroy has already said, I'm sure. So Stephanie, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Susan. Greetings from Norway. It's good to be with you on this webinar. My presentation connects directly to what my colleague Glenroy presented. The church is wanting more. Chapter 4 in TCTCV was an attempt actually to offer some more of what it means to be the church in and for the world. So I will give you a very short summary of what chapter 4 actually said about this being of the church in and for the world. And I'll certainly focus on an impression of what the churches were responding to this chapter 4 and TCT's emphasis that the church is not just an abstract being, it's in and for the world. So if we switch to slide 1. The church in and for the world. TCTCV emphasized in chapter 4, paragraph 58, that the church was intended by God not for its own sake, but to serve the divine plan for the transformation of the world. Thus, service diaconia belongs to the very being of the church. Chapter 4 actually tries to connect and bind together what the church the mission and the being and the mission of the church. In paragraph 67, TCTBCV said, strengthened and nourished by the liturgy, the church must continue the life-giving mission of Christ in prophetic and compassionate ministry to the world, and in struggle against every form of injustice and oppression, mistrust and conflict created by human beings. If you switch to the next slide. So there is an attempt in chapter 4 to develop the understanding of unity and visible unity as an aspect of both faith, service, and sacramental life, and to bind together these different aspects of unity and visible unity through this approach to the church understanding. TCTCV says there's a growing consensus that koinonia, as communion with the Holy Trinity, is manifested in three interrelated ways: unity in faith, unity in sacramental life, and unity in service, in all its forms, including ministry and mission. Chapter 4 focuses especially on this unity in service. If you switch to the next slide, please. So this is a very short, not a summary, but an attempt to tell what chapter 4 was trying to achieve in the context of TCTCV. The church is responding to TCTCV were predominantly positive towards chapter 4. The demand for a reciprocal relationship between human and lived experience and ecclesiological insights was underlined in many of the responses. There was also a very strong affirmation of TCTCV's connection of mission and unity, and speaking out together and working together in the service for the world might contribute to a growth in unity of the churches and serve as a sign of unity towards the world. A number of the responses actually emphasized that the unity of the churches and the unity towards the world in service for the world belong together. Serving the world also contributes to the credibility of the church's proclamation of the good news. That was underlined by a number of churches. Shared mission and theological dialogue are essentially related and contribute to the deepening of communion. So theological dialogue and what some people would say classical ecclesiology and shared mission are interrelated and inseparable. Many churches also underlined the importance of a contextual and local presence of the church. The responses reflected a strong call for theology, for a theology that is grounded in human realities and expressed in a style and language that truly connects with the people. Chapter 4, the church in and for the world, in a way is an attempt to meet this demand by the churches. If you go to the next slide. What was also very obvious in most of the responses addressing chapter 4 positively is that they said it's not enough, and maybe also it's not good enough. We need more of it. Faith and Order should develop and deepen the ecclesiological work, which takes into account the church's life in the world in different contexts and society. Several churches are also asking for a better mutual integration of chapter 1 to 3 and chapter 4. And actually, there were also some churches saying, well, we should start with chapter 4. We should start with an understanding of the church in and for the world, and from this starting point, develop the whole ecclesiology. Relating the concept of koinonia to the lived life of the church in the world was also emphasized frequently. So koinonia and the life of the church in the world should be held together. That includes also the integrity of creation. So these were some of the points raised by the churches responding to especially chapter 4, and also asking for an extension of chapter 4. If we go to the next slide. A few of the responses were also critical to chapter 4, saying that it is underdeveloped, it's not good enough. An ecumenical reflection about the church in society needs to broaden the table to other sciences. So some churches were also underlining that talking about the church in and for the world can not only be done on the basis of a theological reflection. There were also churches underlining that Faith and Order should develop a more holistic ecclesiological approach, including a necessary interaction of diaconia, service, martyria, witness, and liturgia, worship and liturgy. So this interaction and integratedness of these approaches into Faith and Order's understanding of the church was asked for frequently. And if we go to the next slide, which is the last slide, holding together the doctrine of the church and her life in and for the world is something many of the responses asked for. Reciprocity and mutual dependency. Also underlining that the life of the church in the world is intrinsically interwoven with the life of the church as koinonia in word and sacrament. Both are based on God sending the Missio Dei. Most of the churches actually positively affirmed this understanding as it is developed in chapter 4. Many churches also emphasized a need for grounding or earthing of theology in the real and lived reality of people. To conclude, I just would want to share with you a couple of questions raising from the reading of the responses. How can our search for unity be a source of renewal for both the Christian church and the whole creation? And secondly, what does our work related to justice, peace, and the integrity of creation tell us about the nature of the church? So these are some questions and remarks growing out of the reading and the analysis of the responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And it's fascinating to see how the responses on chapter 4 mirror so well what Glenroy has told us about the responses on the theme of mission. And we can see how many in the churches celebrated the direction that the text went and how it developed, but also wanted to press us to go further. I'm going now to turn to Bishop George, if he will not mind me calling him that. Bishop George, you in 2009 encouraged Faith and Order to develop the text in the direction in which it went, and the direction in which clearly the churches are encouraging us to go yet further. So I would be fascinated to hear how you see and hear what the responses have said, and how we might plan the next steps forward. So I'm very grateful to you for coming into this conversation once again, having been a key voice in it so far. And please tell us what you hear as you hear what the responses said. Bishop.
Thank you so much, Susan, for the kind words. Very good afternoon from India. Friends, at the very outset, I'd like to express my deepest sense of gratitude to the Faith and Order Commission, its moderator and its director, and particularly to Dr. Annie Gasrayan-Trisi for the kind invitation to offer a response to the official responses on the convergence document, The Church Towards a Common Vision, popularly known as the TCTCV. I must say that I have enjoyed reading the text and some of the reflections on the ecclesial responses to the document. I should probably mention here that what I propose to offer here are purely my personal reflections on the text, not from the perspective of the church that I represent, the Orthodox Church, or the commission that I chair, the CWME. These are purely my personal reflections. Let me start with some general observations. Reading through the text and the commentaries on the official responses to the TCTCV reminded me of my own experience with the first ever reference group on human sexuality appointed by the World Council of Churches immediately after the Harare Assembly. The reference group decided to ask the member churches of the WCC to send in their official statements on human sexuality. If my memory serves me right, we received around 80 statements. And you will not be surprised to know that there was hardly any response from the churches in the global south, especially from Africa and Asia. I gather that your experience with the TCTCV has been no different. The conspicuous absence of responses from the global south, as you have rightly observed, is in itself a response. The silence of the global south here is loud. The apparent lethargy, the global south, about texts in general, has among other things deep cultural reasons. The textual tradition has not always been the dominant or the most popular tradition in the global south. This implies that the narratives that are unwritten or unrecorded are also narratives that matter. My sense is that this should also challenge all of us to ask questions about the traditional methodology of doing theology that is engaged in our ongoing work. How much of the text and publications that are produced actually reach and have an impact at the grassroots level? I also sense a growing feeling of fatigue caused by a certain obsession with texts and documents, and also with a particular way of doing theology within Faith and Order Commission. This, I acknowledge, has also been reflected in various ways, as we have already heard from the responses from the panelists, and with varying intensity in some of the church responses on the document. Perhaps time has come for all of us to pause, to ponder over, and to explore alternate ways of reflecting on faith, order, and mission that matter. I would leave it there for the moment. Having made the general comment, let me make some specific observations. And in the interest of time, I will only make a couple of comments here. First, let me comment on the very title of the document, The Church Towards a Common Vision. I have emphasized the word common here. Is the quest for a common vision of the church an absolute necessity? The Faith and Order Commission needs to take into consideration and address some of the crucial questions that are being raised about the contextual pertinence of paradigms like conciliar ecumenism. When the Commission continues to engage in theological reflections on concepts such as conciliarity, doctrinal convergence, consensus, and common vision of the church, it should not overlook a stream of theological narratives, sometimes counter-theological narratives that are being offered, especially in the form of post-colonial expressions of ecumenism and ecclesiology. These strands have been consistently arguing that the conventional conciliar model of global ecumenism, with its somewhat exclusive focus on visible unity of churches, has effectively reduced ecumenism into its theological project, dogmatics of ecclesiological discourse, and as a consequence, taken much of the movement character away from global ecumenism. The problem, as a recent statement issued by the Korea Institute of Future Ecumenism, KIFE, observes, is not so much about conciliar fellowship per se, but fellowship without a prophetic movement. Not so much about unity per se, but unity without justice. Incidentally, this is one of the critiques on the theme of the forthcoming WCC Assembly as well. can we talk about unity without justice? As an alternative discourse, post-colonial theologies put forward the notion of what is called ecumenism of manyness over against the traditional notion of ecumenism of oneness or unity, a common vision of the church, and so on. They also hold that it is at the fringes or at the margins of society that manyness is celebrated. I'd like to invite your attention to the works on ecclesiology by people like George Rieger, Paul D.L. Evis, Y.T. Vinayaraj, Gladson Jatana, Barbara Rosing, Sally McFagg, Raj Bharat Patta, to name just a few. Margins, they maintain, are sites that disrupt traditional perceptions of what ecumenism is and ought to be about. It enfleshes the spirituality of life that affirms difference, that affirms dissent, human dignity, justice, equality, and integrity of creation. They also remind us that the original context of the ecumenical councils was one of empire, and that they were convened by the empire, the emperors. The empire did not want any dissent in the oikumene. The imperial version of centralized unity was imposed on the then oikumene. The same imperial logic of getting rid of difference and dissent also had its influence on the ecumenical councils. According to Paul D.L. Evis, even the four marks of the church that the early councils affirmed that this text talks about had an imperial context and even content about them. This calls for an empire lens, a post-colonial sensitivity to look at ecumenism, unity, and common vision of the church, and so on, which in my view is evidently absent in the TCTCV. It is this post-colonial approach and the empire lens, among other things, that has made the CWMA mission text Together Towards Life, TTL, an organic text with contemporary relevance. Secondly, and finally, looking at the TCTCV from the perspective I adopted on the NMC document in my Crete response, the TCTCV is certainly a great step forward. It has tried to harvest the insights from the NMC text. It also appropriates the paradigm of Missio Dei and brings mission and communion together. One of my critiques on the NMC text, as was reminded by Susan in the introduction, was that the ecclesiology inherent in the text was largely an ecclesiology from above. As I said, the TCTCV in this sense does move further and forward, but not far enough. One comes across parts of missional ecclesiology in the text, but only in parts. As some of the church responses themselves make it clear, the missional ecclesiology in the TCTCV appears to be an add-on subject. In other words, it's not fully integrated in the document. Unlike the TTL, where an organic theology of church's mission is explicated, especially in relation to the paradigm of mission for the margins, what is lacking in the TCTCV is an ecclesiology from the margins. As I have already indicated, the Faith and Order Commission has consciously or otherwise chosen to ignore parallel streams of ecclesiological discourse. For example, George Rieger and Kok Pui Lan, basing their reflections on the notion of the multitude, oklos, basically from Hart and Negri, reimagines the church as ecclesia of the multitude, itself defined as a democratic and egalitarian space where nobody is excluded and where polyphony is celebrated. This concept of church and mission from the margins is what has made the TTL a text with life. And the TCTCV, from this angle, suffers from a certain lifelessness. The TCTCV does make genuine efforts in addressing the issue of church's role and mission in the world, but once again falls short in making it a concern that permeates throughout the text. For instance, the TCTCV does take up the BEM insight that the church is in fact a prefiguring of the reign of God, where mission is rooted in the divine call to all humanity to be God's people. However, the text, in my view, misses an opportunity to take this idea of peoplehood further and to come up with an incarnational ecclesiology, which would be grounded in the mundane lives of people. This is precisely what Robert Suderman does in his Baby and the Bath Potter, where he goes beyond the conventional counters of ecclesiological debate and thus brings fresh life and dynamism into the discourse. Suderman reinterprets the being and becoming of the church in terms of formation of a new peoplehood in history, an ecclesiology of enfleshing. The Council for World Mission, to cite another example, has recently published a series of 11 volumes on church, on reimagining church as an event from the perspective of the margins. In these volumes, a collective of young Indian theologians attempts to envision church as an event that happens in particular context of marginality, where church as an event becomes, and I quote, a call to rise into life, creating life-flourishing communities that live out the foretaste of the reign of God, unquote. As already indicated, due to the absence of an empire perspective, the text does not attempt to de-imperialize or decolonize doctrines and the ways in which faith is articulated, a task which we can ill afford to ignore, as thinkers such as Giorgio Agamben warn us. I quote Agamben here: "Post-coloniality is a time of retreat for the church to inoperate its inherent juridical structures, doctrines, and liturgies, and to become a messianic community, a community for those who have no community at all," unquote. Incidentally, the pandemic in its own ways has also drawn our attention to some of these pressing challenges regarding what really constitutes the ecclesia and what really matters in terms of faith, order, mission, communion, fellowship, and service in times such as ours today. Agamben calls it a church that comes, a coming community where justice will prevail. These are utopias of ecclesiology from the margins that the TCTCV has bypassed. Given the long tradition, the rich legacy, and the inherent theological methodologies that have historically shaped the life and work of the Faith and Order Commission, it may not be possible for the Commission to completely accommodate the perspectives and methodologies that it isn't accustomed to. However, it cannot afford to leave aside and completely ignore alternative theological streams that might appear to be running parallel or even contrary to its own conventional directions. To engage them and to converse with them, in my view, isn't an option, but a theological vocation which the Faith and Order Commission must embrace. With these few words, I thank you, our sister commission, once again for the opportunity to dialogue with you. As always, I have enjoyed interacting with you, and for the profound theological contributions you continue to make and offer to the ecumenical fraternity, we will always remain grateful to you. Once again, many thanks for having me on this panel. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you so much, Bishop George, for, as ever, challenging us profoundly. I mentioned at the beginning that you are a critical friend and you are not afraid to say words that challenge us deeply. And I can hear that your own thinking has moved on and deepened and become more challenging to us even since 2009 and when you made that speech in Crete.
Thank you.
And I think we all understand how our sense of the relationship between theology and empire has begun to deepen and be challenged in recent times. And I hope you can sense that Faith and Order has been grateful to be part of this critical dialogue and has indeed wanted to grow and has grown through it.
Sure.
And our own work has changed considerably. But I would like now, we've heard so much, to move to a time of question from those who are listening and those who are participating. So Annie, I think you are going to present to us some of the questions that we've heard.
Yes, thank you, Susan. We have one question coming from Ellen Wondra. The question is, what do the responses suggest about the particular gifts and skills of lay people for mission and evangelism?
Thank you. Glenroy, I wonder if you would be able to answer that for us. Do the responses make any reference to that?
Responses from the churches to TCTCV, we detected some disappointment in the role and the place of the laity within the life of the church. And there was a sense that our understanding of church was still too hierarchical. In addition to that, there was almost a call for a greater engagement with communion ecclesiology. And so in that respect, the understanding was that the mission of the church is the mission of the whole people of God. And that was not as distinct as it ought to have been within the document. That is my understanding of what the responses were.
Thank you, Glenroy. Annie?
Another question is coming from Victor Aguilan. The document has not fully addressed the issue of Western colonization and Christian mission. Today, Christianity is growing in the South. How can the ecumenical movement address the issue of mission and colonial or neocolonial or decolonization?
Thank you, Annie. I think I'd just like to make a comment at this point to let people know that while we've been receiving the responses to TCTCV, there has been a parallel project of other faith and order commissioners with some overlap, also trying to have a conversation, to widen the conversation about the nature of the church with people who have not been involved in this conversation about this text. So we already, for the past 8 years or so, have been exploring conversations with churches all around the world, with churches who have not been part of the traditional ecumenical movement. So we have been trying to address issues of how the ecumenical movement has been identified with the colonial powers and how Christianity is growing in the global South, how world Christianity is changing. So we've been trying to be part of a wider conversation. I don't know whether Stephanie would want to respond at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think both what Your Eminence emphasized when it comes to the reading of TCTCV and this question show that there is a lot of more work to be done within the framework of faith and order, and maybe also some work which has to be done differently. And I think there is an agreement both from many of those who have responded, but also in conversation with churches, Christians all around the world who have not responded because maybe they do not find reading theological texts like the texts coming from Faith and Order necessarily relevant for what they are doing within the framework of their churches. So we are trying to be in a dialogue with many of these churches. And I would also say that chapter 4, the church in and for the world, is only a beginning when it comes to rephrasing the way we are doing ecclesiology, taking into account that the church is not only an abstract construction or a theological point of belief, but it's actually something which is rooted and lived in the life of the people. Also connecting to the question from Ellen Wondra on the laity and the people of God. Maybe also starting with an ecclesiology, a baptismal ecclesiology, starting with the understanding that all the baptized constitute the church and are members of the church, and thus help us to have a different understanding of the church when starting from the people of God, the baptized. Just a short comment also in relation to what you were underlining, Your Eminence. I think your your criticism of TC-TCV was very much online with lots of the responses to TC-TCV, and the Commission is also aware that there is many people all around the world who are asking the questions who are asking, and we are trying to get also into conversation with some people who are interested in doing ecclesiology, but maybe in a different way than before.
Thank you, Stephanie. Annie, another question?
There is a comment coming from Karen Kelawan, who is appreciating Metropolitan's thoughts and the discussion on the empire and the global south in its concept of ecumenism and mission. A question is coming from also Nishat Isaac Kanji. Can TC-TCV be encouraged to incorporate the other of identities, sexualities, and mainness in creation?
Glenn Roy, would you like to respond to that question?
I'll begin by saying that what is written is written. So, but what TC-TCV is a starting point for a conversation, as you mentioned, a conversation with the other group working parallel with us about working with churches in various other contexts. It is also a starting point for a conversation, hearing from His Eminence, a conversation with the missionary arm of the mission arm of the WCC. And it is also a starting point for conversation with many other groups, including groups dealing with human sexualities and other kinds of identity. So I think that what we have is a starting point for a conversation, but the perspectives have been laid on the table, and the criticisms and the affirmations have also been laid on the table. And there is no an agenda for a conversation. That's how I would respond to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn Roy. And Your Eminence, you wanted to make a comment, please.
Yeah, I wanted to make a quick comment. Thank you, Susan. I really appreciated the questions that have come up so far. The question on the emphasis on laity in mission and church, I think it's an important one. But at my presentation, I was going a step further. It's not enough even to be focusing on the laity. Laos is one thing, but Oklos is a different emphasis. And this is what I was trying to argue in my thinking about ecclesiology of the Oklos. It's not about the laity in general, but a section of the laity who are the most underprivileged. This is what we would like to call ecclesiology from the margins, where the Oklos, the poorest of the poor, take on the agency in ecclesiology and mission. And the other comment about the lack of emphasis on colonialism or decolonialism is something that I was trying to say in my presentation, the absence of an empire lens. And this is what we have tried to do in our own way in TTL, particularly focusing on the global south and also from a post-colonial perspective. I'm glad that these critiques are coming from within the Faith and Order Commission itself, and I appreciate those.
Thank you. Thank you. Annie, is there another question?
Yes, there is a question. Does the Global South churches speak united or with divergent views? Liberation theologies and Black theology, and how are these voices being heard?
Stephanie, would you like to address that?
Well, I think when we were receiving during this period of the Faith and Order work, when we were receiving the responses, we were certainly sad that there were very few responses from countries in the global south, from Africa, and from the perspective many of the people posing questions are asking. So this is really something we were missing in the responses, and the attempt to get into a conversation with the people who do not necessarily answer or reply to doctrinal documents coming from the Faith and Order Commission, I think is one of the ways we are also trying to include these perspectives in the work of Faith and Order. And certainly TCV is a convergence text which has been adopted. So, but the further work surely will focus on opening up the discourse and trying to have more people around the table. I think for sure that this will be the work of Faith and Order for the future. To broaden the table and to broaden the perspective, and to include not at least the perspectives mentioned both in the questions in the chat and also from you, Your Eminence. It's a starting point where we are now, and we are becoming more and more aware that this is the direction we have to go, and we are very thankful for all the inputs to this process.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. I think we might have time for one very quick question.
One very quick question is the connection between the work of Faith and Order, between TCV and moral discernment. And what are the connection? The question is coming from Thomas Best, and overlap between TCV project and the work on moral discernment.
Yes, well, perhaps if I might venture a quick response to that, which is to say that in the work on moral discernment addresses the places where there is division among and between the churches on moral and ethical questions, and that this has become the place now, perhaps even more than doctrine, where churches feel the pain and threat of division. And it is one of the places where the voices of those on the margins perhaps are heard. And that work, I think, addresses another, looks for ways in which people who are not at peace with one another can begin to facilitate dialogue. So I think that it is a place where Faith and Order is doing crucial work to call the churches to unity, but in a way that is addressing the questions that some people are actually asking, in a way that some people are not asking the questions that are in the church towards a common vision. So some people are still passionately invested in the questions that the church towards the common vision is asking. So I think that's something of the connection. The moral discernment work really reveals how Faith and Order is doing things in new ways. That's one of the ways it's working. We are working in new ways. So I can see there are more questions in the chat. There are people wanting to have a copy of your address, Your Eminence, and I'm sure we can, if you're willing, make that available somehow. But
absolutely.
I know we must draw this to a close now. So I want to thank very warmly Stephanie and Glenroy, our two commissioners, for participating in this webinar, and indeed for all the work that you've done over years on receiving and analysing these responses with others. And our thanks to Annie too, our Faith and Order support staff, and it's wonderful to have you with us. And of course, thank you so much, Your Eminence, Metropolitan Gervase Morkurinos, for your, as ever, provoking and profound input. I do want to say that there are 2 more webinars to come this year, on September the 30th, on Koinonia and Visible Unity, again on what the responses said, and on roles and ministries in the church on December the 2nd, again this year. There'll be more to come in future years. And of course, we're all looking forward to the World Council of Churches Assembly in Karlsruhe from August the 31st to September the 8th, 2022. So can I say thank you to all of you who are participating, all of you who've come, all of you who might be watching this later. Please join us again, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.